There are some things about this job that you learn to accept without question, and then there are things that make you question everything you thought you knew about death. I'm Patricia Holloway, and I've been the director at Riverside Memorial Funeral Home for 15 years. In that time, I've seen grief in every form imaginable, the quiet dignity of elderly spouses, the raw anguish of young parents, the complicated relief of adult children saying goodbye to difficult relationships. I've learned that death brings out the most honest parts of people, stripping away pretense until only truth remains. But what I discovered in Viewing Room C has taught me that sometimes the dead have their own truths to tell. Riverside Memorial sits on the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, a stately Victorian building that's been serving our community since 1923. The viewing rooms are on the main floor, each decorated in muted blues and grays, with rows of cushioned chairs facing a small podium where we display the casket during services. Room C is the smallest of the three, usually reserved for intimate gatherings or when families request privacy. It's also the room where Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore appears every night at 11:47 p.m. I first noticed her 3 years ago when I was reviewing security footage after a break-in at the flower shop next door. Our cameras hadn't caught anything unusual outside, but when I scrolled through the interior footage, I saw an elderly woman in a black dress and hat, sitting alone in the back row of Room C. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, facing the empty podium with an expression of patient attention. At 12:04 a.m., she simply vanished between one frame and the next, like she'd never been there at all. I assumed it was a technical glitch. Security cameras, especially older ones, can create strange artifact shadows that look like people, reflections that seem to move independently. But when I checked the footage the next night, she was there again. Same seat, same posture, same 17-minute vigil, and the night after that, and the night after that. The woman appeared only on our infrared cameras, never on the standard color feed. During the day, when I walked through Room C, I felt nothing unusual, just the familiar weight of quiet grief that seems to settle into the walls of places like this. But at night, watching those grainy black and white images, I could almost feel her presence through the screen. There was something about the way she sat, so still and attentive, as if she were listening to words only she could hear. I started staying late specifically to observe her appearances. From my office, I could see into Room C through the doorway, but I never saw her with my own eyes. She existed only in the digital realm of our security system, a ghost in the machine who kept her nightly appointments with religious precision. I told myself it was simply a malfunction, a recurring glitch that created the same phantom image night after night. But as the months passed, I found myself oddly comforted by her presence. In a business built around loss, there was something reassuring about her faithful vigil. The mystery deepened when I noticed subtle changes in her appearance. Some nights, her dress appeared to have small floral patterns. Other nights, she wore what looked like a brooch or pin on her lapel. Once, I could have sworn I saw her hand move slightly, adjusting the position of her purse on her lap. These weren't the repetitive actions of a digital artifact. They were the small, unconscious movements of a living person. I began keeping detailed logs of her appearances. 11:47 p.m. every night without fail. She would materialize in the same seat, 3rd row from the back, always on the right side of the aisle. For exactly 17 minutes, she would sit in perfect stillness, her attention focused on the empty podium. Then, at 12:04 a.m., she would fade away like morning mist. My assistant, Janet, thought I was losing my mind. "Patricia," she'd say, "you're staring at shadows and calling them people. Maybe it's time to take a vacation." But I knew what I was seeing. This wasn't pareidolia or wishful thinking. This was something else entirely. The breakthrough came 6 months ago when I decided to research the history of Room C. I spent an entire weekend in our archives, going through decades of service records, visitor logs, and facility reports. The funeral home had been renovated several times over the years, but Room C had remained largely unchanged since the 1980s. As I worked my way through the yellowed pages of old logbooks, one entry made me stop cold. November 15th, 1987. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had signed the visitor log for a memorial service in Room C. The handwriting was spidery but clear, and beside her name was a notation I'd never seen before. Special accommodation. Extended viewing requested. Below that, in different ink, someone had written, "Arrangement honored. E.W. To remain as long as needed." I stared at that page for a long time, my hands trembling slightly as I held the aging paper. Eleanor Whitmore. The same name that appeared on dozens of visitor logs throughout the late 80s and early 90s, always for services held in Room C. But the entry stopped abruptly in 1994, with no explanation or final notation. Driven by a growing sense of urgency, I dug deeper into the archives. In a box of old newspaper clippings, I found Eleanor's obituary from the local paper, dated March 22, 1994. She was survived by no immediate family, and the brief article mentioned her long career as a church organist and her dedication to comforting grieving families. The funeral service was held at Riverside Memorial, in Room C, but it was the final line of the obituary that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Whitmore often said that death was simply another door, and that love required no invitation to pass through. That night, I positioned myself in Room C at 11:45 p.m., sitting in the front row with my laptop open, streaming the security feed in real time. The room was dark, except for the soft glow of the emergency exit signs and the pale light from my screen. As the minutes ticked by, I felt a strange anticipation, like waiting for an old friend to arrive. At exactly 11:47 p.m., she appeared on the screen, but this time, I could feel her presence in the room. The temperature dropped perceptibly, and I could hear the faint sound of fabric rustling, as if someone were settling into a chair behind me. On the laptop screen, Eleanor Whitmore sat in her usual seat, but now I could see her more clearly than ever before. Her face was kind but worn, lined with the patient sorrow of someone who had witnessed countless farewells. For 17 minutes, we sat together in that quiet room, she in her world, I in mine, connected by something deeper than death. I understood then that she wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. She was a guardian, a keeper of sorrows, ensuring that no one grieved alone. The empty podium wasn't empty to her, it was filled with the memories of every person who had ever been mourned in that room. When she vanished at 12:04 a.m., she left behind something I hadn't expected: peace. Not the false comfort of platitudes or the hollow reassurance of religious certainty, but the genuine peace that comes from knowing that love transcends the boundaries we think define life and death. I still watch for Eleanor every night, and she still appears with clockwork precision. But now I understand that she's not haunting Room, she's blessing it. In a place where people come to say goodbye, she remains as a testament to the fact that some bonds are too strong for death to break. Yesterday, I added a new entry to our visitor log: Eleanor Whitmore, permanent guest, because some people earn the right to stay as long as they're needed, and sometimes the dead are the most faithful companions of all. The viewing room's last guest will always have a seat reserved in row C, watching over the grieving with the infinite patience of love that has learned to wait. The earth has its own memory, and some graves refuse to stay closed. I'm Samuel Torres, though everyone calls me Sam, and I've been the head groundskeeper at Oakwood Cemetery for 22 years. In that time, I've dug more graves than I care to count, laid more souls to rest than most people meet in a lifetime. I know the feel of different soils, the sandy loam that crumbles easy, the clay that fights your shovel, the rocky ground that makes every stroke a battle. I know how deep to dig, how to shore up walls, how to make sure the earth holds its shape until the service is done and the family says their final goodbyes. But Plot 47 in the old section breaks every rule I've learned about dirt and death. Oakwood Cemetery sprawls across 43 acres on the east side of town, established in 1862 when the original church graveyard ran out of space. The old section sits on a gentle slope overlooking the valley, where the headstones lean at weathered angles and the names have been worn smooth by decades of rain and wind. It's peaceful work, mostly maintaining the grounds, preparing new sites, helping families navigate their grief with dignity and respect. My days start at sunrise with a walk through the grounds, checking for fallen branches, damaged headstones, or areas that need attention. The old section requires the most care tree roots that push up through ancient graves, settling that creates uneven ground, the constant battle against entropy that comes with age. I've always found comfort in the routine, the methodical way I can restore order to places where time has left its mark. Plot 47 sits in the northeast corner of the old section, marked by a simple granite headstone that reads, "Beloved," with no names or dates. The plot has been empty for as long as I've worked here, though the cemetery records show it was purchased in 1893. Sometimes plots stay empty for decades. Family members move away, plans change, circumstances shift. But Plot 47 has been requested for burial 6 times in my tenure, and every time the same thing happens. The first time was 8 years ago, for an elderly woman named Margaret Henley. I started digging on a Tuesday morning, marking out the standard dimensions: 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, 6 feet deep. The soil was typical for that area, dark earth mixed with clay. A little rocky, but nothing unusual. I dug about 3 feet down when I noticed the walls starting to bow inward slightly. Not uncommon with certain soil types, so I installed wooden shoring to keep the sides stable. Wednesday morning, I found the hole had collapsed. Not just settled, completely collapsed, as if the earth had been sucked down into a void. The hole was now 12 feet deep, perfectly round, with smooth walls that looked almost polished. I assumed it was a sinkhole, though we'd never had geological issues in that area. I called the city engineer, who came out and scratched his head before declaring it a localized subsidence event and recommending we avoid the area. The second time was 3 years later, for a Vietnam veteran named Robert Kane. Against my better judgment, I agreed to try Plot 47 again. The family had specifically requested it because of its view of the valley. I dug more carefully this time, checking the soil composition every few inches, reinforcing the walls with steel plating instead of wood. Same result. Wednesday morning, 12-foot hole, smooth walls, like something had reached up from below and pulled the earth down. By the third attempt, I developed a theory. There had to be an underground cave system, something that created instability in that specific location. I brought in ground-penetrating radar, had the area surveyed by a geological team, even had the water table tested. Nothing. The reports showed solid ground, typical clay and limestone composition, no voids or cavities. Yet every time I dug in that spot, the same thing happened. The fourth time, I decided to stay and watch. I set up a camping chair about 20 feet away and kept vigil through the night after digging the grave. At exactly 2:47 a.m., I heard it to sound like a massive inhalation, as if the earth itself was taking a deep breath. The hole didn't collapse violently. It sank, slowly and steadily, dirt flowing downward like water, disappearing into darkness that seemed to have no bottom. That's when I started hearing my name. It began as a whisper, so faint I thought it was whined through the trees. But as I leaned closer to the expanding hole, I could make out my name being called from somewhere deep below. Not just one voice, multiple voices, overlapping, calling Sam and Samuel and Torres, in tones that ranged from pleading to urgent to something that sounded almost grateful. I stopped accepting burials for Plot 47 after that, told the office it was permanently unsuitable due to geological instability. But families kept requesting it, drawn by its location and the peaceful view. The cemetery director, Mrs. Patterson, started pressuring me to make it work. "It's prime real estate," she'd say. "We can't just leave it empty forever." Last month, she gave me an ultimatum. Make Plot 47 functional, or find another job. 22 years of service, and she was willing to let me go over one problematic gravesite. So I decided to try one more time, with every technique I'd learned and every precaution I could think of. I started digging on a Monday, working in the early morning when the ground was still cool and firm. Instead of the standard 6-foot depth, I planned to dig only 4 feet maybe. The instability was triggered by going too deep. I installed a grid of rebar reinforcement, poured concrete footings, even brought in a portable generator to power industrial fans that would keep air circulating in the hole. Tuesday morning, I found the hole exactly as I'd left it. 4 feet deep, walls stable, reinforcement intact. I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction before continuing the work, carefully excavating another foot of depth. The soil felt different this time, warmer somehow, as if heated from below. But the walls held, and I finished the day with a properly dug grave. Tuesday night, I decided to keep watch again. I positioned myself with a clear view of the hole, armed with a thermos of coffee and a high-powered flashlight. At 2:30 a.m., I noticed the temperature beginning to drop. My breath started misting, and frost began forming on the grass around the gravesite. The hole itself seemed to be generating heat, steam rising from its depths like a geothermal vent. At 2:47 a.m., the voices started. This time, they weren't whispers. They were clear, distinct, calling my name with an urgency that made my blood run cold. But it wasn't just my name. They were having conversations, discussing me as if I were an expected guest who was running late. "Sam's here," one voice said, followed by another responding, "Finally, we've been waiting." A third voice, higher and more childlike, added, "He's been so good to us, taking care of the grounds." I realized, with growing horror, that these weren't random voices. They were the voices of people I'd buried over the years, Mrs. Henley, Robert Kane, dozens of others whose names I remembered from headstones and funeral programs. They knew me, had been watching me, waiting for me to join them in whatever space existed beneath Plot 47. The hole began to collapse then, but this time I was close enough to see what was really happening. The earth wasn't falling, it was being pulled. Tendrils of shadow reached up from the depths, wrapping around clods of soil and dragging them down into darkness. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear them arguing about whether I was ready, whether it was time. "Not yet," said a voice I recognized as Mrs. Patterson's predecessor, old Mr. Grimsby, who died 5 years ago. "He has more work to do." "The grounds need tending," agreed another voice, this one belonging to a young woman who'd been buried after a car accident. "The living need someone to watch over the dead." As the hole deepened, reaching that familiar 12-foot depth, I understood what Plot 47 really was. It wasn't a grave, it was a doorway. A place where the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin, where those who cared for the deceased could eventually join them in their eternal vigil. The voices weren't threatening me, they were welcoming me, acknowledging my decades of service, letting me know that when my time came, I would have a place with them. But not yet. I still tend the grounds at Oakwood Cemetery, though I've had Plot 47 permanently sealed with concrete and marked as unusable. The voices still call my name sometimes, especially during the quiet hours before dawn, but they're patient now. They know I understand my purpose to care for the dead until I'm ready to join them. Mrs. Patterson doesn't question my decision about Plot 47 anymore. Maybe she's heard the voices too, or maybe she simply learned that some things are better left undisturbed. Either way, the plot remains empty, waiting for someone who understands that some graves are meant to be doorways, and some groundskeepers are meant to be guardians of more than just the earth. The weight of Plot 47 isn't measured in soil, and stone, it's measured in the accumulated love of those who refuse to let death be the end of caring. Some sounds carry more weight than silence, and in my line of work, you learn to listen for things that shouldn't be there. I'm Catherine Brennan, though everyone calls me Cat, and I've been the night embalmer at Riverside Memorial Funeral Home for 9 years. Most people think my job is morbid, working alone with the dead in the basement preparation rooms while the rest of the world sleeps. But there's something peaceful about the night shift. No interruptions, no family members asking questions I can't answer, just me and the quiet work of helping people look like themselves one last time. Riverside Memorial sits in the heart of downtown, a converted mansion from the 1920s that's been serving families for 3 generations. The preparation rooms are in the basement, cool and sterile, with industrial ventilation systems that hum constantly. Upstairs, the main floor houses the viewing rooms and offices, while the second floor used to contain additional prep space before we consolidated operations downstairs 6 months ago. My shift starts at 11 p.m. and runs until 7 a.m. I prefer the solitude. Lets me focus entirely on the work, giving each person the care and attention they deserve. Embalming is both science and art, requiring precision, patience, and respect. Every person who comes through these doors was someone's parent, child, spouse, friend. They deserve to be treated with dignity, to look peaceful for those who love them. The work itself is methodical. I start by reviewing the case files, understanding any special requests from families or requirements from the funeral director. Then comes the physical preparation, washing, positioning, beginning the preservation process that will allow families time to say goodbye. It's quiet work, contemplative, often accompanied by classical music playing softly from speakers mounted near the ceiling. But lately, I've been hearing something else. It started about 3 weeks ago, during a particularly busy night when I was working on an elderly gentleman who'd passed peacefully in his sleep. I was adjusting the positioning of his hands when I heard a faint humming coming from somewhere above me. The melody was familiar, one of those old hymns you hear at traditional services. How great thou art, I thought, though I couldn't be certain. I paused, listening carefully, but the sound faded away. The building settles at night. Pipes expand and contract, and sound travels strangely through the old walls. I dismissed it as nothing unusual and returned to my work. The next night, I heard it again. Same melody, same faint quality, as if someone was humming softly while concentrating on a task. This time, I was sure it was coming from directly overhead from Prep Room B on the main floor, which had been our secondary embalming suite before the renovation. We'd moved all operations downstairs to improve efficiency and reduce the noise that might disturb viewing services. I checked the building log. No one was scheduled to be working upstairs, and the security system showed no unauthorized entries. The night guard, Miguel, was making his rounds on the other side of the building, but when I climbed the stairs to investigate, I found Prep Room B exactly as we'd left it, empty, cleaned, and locked. Over the following weeks, the humming became a regular occurrence, always between 3 and 4 a.m., always the same hymn, always from Prep Room B. I started timing it, noting the pattern in my work journal, 3:17 a.m., every night without fail, lasting exactly 8 minutes. During those 8 minutes, the building felt different, not threatening, but occupied in a way that had nothing to do with the living. I mentioned it to Miguel during one of his security rounds. He's worked nights at Riverside for 15 years and has heard every sound the old building makes. Never heard humming, he said, but I have noticed something odd about that room. Temperature sensor keeps triggering alerts. Thermostat shows someone's been adjusting it every night. That caught my attention. Climate control is crucial in our work bodies, need to be kept at specific temperatures for preservation. But Prep Room B had been disconnected from the main HVAC system when we moved operations downstairs. There was no reason for anyone to be adjusting the temperature, and certainly no reason for the old manual thermostat to be changing on its own. The next night, I decided to monitor both the humming and the temperature more carefully. I positioned a digital thermometer near the basement ceiling, directly below Prep Room B, and kept a careful log of temperature fluctuations throughout my shift. At 3:15 a.m., I heard the familiar sound of footsteps overhead soft, measured, like someone moving carefully around furniture. Then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., the humming began. The temperature in my prep room dropped 3 degrees during those 8 minutes, not gradually suddenly, as if someone had opened a door to the outside. But it wasn't cold air coming in. It was as if the warmth was being drawn upward, pulled towards something that needed it more than we did. I climbed the stairs during the humming, moving as quietly as possible. The main floor was dark except for the emergency lighting, and Prep Room B's door remained locked. But I could feel warmth radiating from the other side of the door, like standing near a furnace. When I pressed my ear to the wood, the humming was clear, a woman's voice, gentle and practiced, the kind of voice that had sung in church choirs for decades. The melody was definitely "How Great Thou Art," but it was being hummed with the familiarity of someone who'd sung it countless times. There was something comforting about it, something that reminded me why I'd chosen this profession in the first place. Helping people transition with dignity, providing comfort to families, maintaining the rituals that make death bearable for the living. But when I checked the building's historical records, I found something that made my skin crawl. Prep Room B had been the original embalming suite when Riverside Memorial first opened. According to the old employment records, it had been operated by a woman named Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell from 1923 until 1968, when she'd suffered a heart attack while working alone during the night shift. She'd been found the next morning, still wearing her apron, a half-finished hymn hummed into the silence. The records showed that Mrs. Hartwell had been known for her meticulous care, her gentle treatment of the deceased, and her habit of humming hymns while she worked. She'd specifically requested that Prep Room B be kept at exactly 72 degrees optimal for preservation, but also, she'd told colleagues, because it felt respectful. The dead deserved to be comfortable, she'd often said. Armed with this knowledge, I found myself looking forward to 3:17 a.m. The humming had become a source of comfort, a reminder that the work we do here has meaning beyond the technical aspects. Mrs. Hartwell was still caring for people, still maintaining the standards she'd set during 4 decades of service. The temperature adjustments weren't random, they were professional, purposeful, the actions of someone who understood the importance of proper preservation. Last Tuesday night, I decided to acknowledge her presence directly. At 3:16 a.m., I stood at the bottom of the stairs and spoke softly toward Prep Room B. "Mrs. Hartwell," I said, "thank you for watching over us. Thank you for maintaining the standards." The humming that followed was different, warmer somehow, with a quality of acknowledgement that made tears spring to my eyes. For 8 minutes, I stood in that stairwell listening to a woman who'd dedicated her life to this work, who'd refused to let death end her service to others. But when the humming stopped, I heard something new. Footsteps, moving slowly toward the door of Prep Room B. Not threatening, deliberate, purposeful. I heard the soft click of the lock disengaging, though I knew the door remained sealed. Then silence. The next morning, I found a note tucked under my equipment case. Written in spidery handwriting on old-fashioned letterhead, it read, "Temperature is everything, dear. The families deserve to see them at their best. Keep up the good work, E.H." I've kept that note in my work journal, and I still hear Mrs. Hartwell humming every night at 3:17 a.m. But now I understand that she's not haunting Prep Room, but she's blessing it, ensuring that the standards she maintained for 45 years continue to be met, that every person who passes through Riverside Memorial receives the care and dignity they deserve. The temperature in Prep Room B still gets adjusted to exactly 72 degrees every night. The building logs show it as an anomaly, but I know better. Some people are so dedicated to their work that not even death can make them abandon their post. Mrs. Hartwell taught me that excellence in our profession isn't measured by efficiency or profit margins, it's measured by the comfort we provide to families in their darkest hours and by the respect we show to those who can no longer speak for themselves. Every night, at 3:17 a.m., I pause in my work to listen for her humming, and every night, I'm reminded that the best embalmers never really retire. They just continue their work from a different kind of shift. Love leaves marks that death cannot erase, and sometimes those marks move when no one is watching. I'm Marcus Chen, and I've been the director at Hillcrest Cemetery for 8 years. In that time, I've learned that grief takes many forms. Some people visit graves daily, others never return after the funeral, and still others find their own unique ways to maintain connections with those they've lost. Part of my job is understanding these rituals, respecting them, and ensuring that families feel comfortable expressing their love in whatever way brings them peace. Hillcrest sits on 47 acres of rolling hills about 10 miles outside the city. Established in 1956, when urban development made the older cemeteries impractical for expansion. We pride ourselves on maintaining a peaceful environment where families can visit their loved ones without feeling rushed or uncomfortable. The grounds are meticulously maintained, with wide pathways that accommodate wheelchairs and elderly visitors, mature oak trees that provide shade, and a small chapel for those who want to pray or reflect in silence. My typical Monday starts with a walk through the grounds, checking for any maintenance issues that developed over the weekend, noting flowers that need to be refreshed or decorations that may have been disturbed by weather. It's quiet work that gives me time to think and appreciate the serenity that draws people here during their most difficult moments. Mrs. Elena Valdez has been visiting her husband's grave every Sunday for 3 years, ever since Roberto passed from complications related to diabetes. She's a small, dignified woman in her 70s, who always dresses carefully for her visits. Dark dress, comfortable shoes, a string of pearls that she told me once belonged to her mother. She brings fresh carnations, usually white, with a few pink ones mixed in, and arranges them in a simple spray across the base of Roberto's headstone. I've observed her routine many times during my weekend rounds. She arrives promptly at 10 a.m., parks her old blue Honda near the main gate, and walks slowly down the winding path to Section C, where Roberto rests beneath a modest granite marker. She spends about an hour there, sometimes talking softly, sometimes sitting in silence on the small bench positioned nearby. When she's ready to leave, she carefully arranges the carnations in a horizontal line across the grave, kisses her fingertips, and touches them to Roberto's name carved in the stone. By Monday morning, the flowers are always arranged in a perfect circle around the headstone. At first, I assumed it was the groundskeeping crew. Some cemetery workers develop their own aesthetic preferences and quietly rearrange decorations they feel could look better. But when I asked Tom Briggs, our head groundskeeper, he shook his head. "Never touch Mrs. Valdez's flowers," he said. "She's been through enough without someone messing with her arrangements." I started paying closer attention during my Monday morning walks. The carnations weren't just moved, they were repositioned with mathematical precision, forming a circle exactly 18 inches in diameter, with each flower placed at identical intervals. It was the kind of arrangement that required careful measurement and planning, not the casual adjustment of someone trying to improve the appearance. The mystery deepened when I noticed that the flowers seemed to last longer than they should. Carnations typically begin wilting within 3 to 4 days of being cut, especially when exposed to outdoor conditions. But Mrs. Valdez's flowers remained fresh and vibrant throughout the week, their petals retaining color and texture that defied natural decomposition. I mentioned this to my assistant, Sarah, who handles much of our administrative work and has been at Hillcrest for 12 years. "Have you checked the security footage?" she suggested. We'd installed cameras throughout the cemetery 2 years ago after a series of vandalism incidents, and while we didn't monitor them constantly, the recordings were stored for 30 days. That evening, I pulled up the footage from the previous Sunday, focusing on Section C. Mrs. Valdez's visit was exactly as I'd observed. She arrived, spent her hour with Roberto, arranged the flowers in their horizontal line, and departed. For several hours afterward, nothing appeared to change. The flowers remained exactly as she'd left them, undisturbed by wind or wildlife. But at 11:43 p.m., something remarkable began to happen. The flowers started moving. Not dramatically, individual petals shifted position. Stems rotated slightly. Entire blooms seemed to glide across the surface of the grave. The movement was so gradual that I had to replay sections of footage multiple times to confirm what I was seeing. Over the course of 6 hours, the carnations slowly rearranged themselves into that perfect circle, each flower finding its designated position as if guided by invisible hands. The footage was clear enough to see that no person or animal was causing the movement. The flowers simply moved on their own, rotating and repositioning with deliberate purpose. By dawn, they had formed the precise circle I'd been finding every Monday for months. I watched similar footage from previous weeks, and the pattern was identical. Every Sunday night, around the same time, Mrs. Valdez's carnations would begin their slow migration from horizontal line to perfect circle. The process took approximately 6 hours and involved every single flower moving to a predetermined position. But the most unsettling detail emerged when I reviewed older footage more carefully. The movement wasn't random, it was coordinated, as if multiple invisible hands were working together to create something specific. And occasionally, between the shifting flowers, I could make out what looked like shadows moving across the gravesite, shapes that suggested human figures bending and reaching, though nothing was visible to cast such shadows. I decided to observe the phenomenon in person. Last Sunday night, I positioned myself about 50 yards away from Roberto's grave, armed with night vision binoculars and a thermos of coffee. Mrs. Valdez had made her usual visit that morning, leaving the carnations in their familiar horizontal arrangement. At 11:30 p.m., I felt the temperature begin to drop. Not unusual for late evening, but the change was more pronounced near Roberto's grave than in the surrounding area. Through the binoculars, I could see frost beginning to form on the grass around the headstone, creating a visible boundary that corresponded exactly to where the flower circle would eventually appear. At 11:43 p.m., the flowers began to move. What I witnessed defied every rational explanation I could construct. The carnations didn't slide or roll, they lifted slightly off the ground and glided through the air, rotating and positioning themselves with the precision of a choreographed dance. But more disturbing than the movement itself was what I could sense but not quite see, the presence of figures working around the grave. Through the night vision binoculars, I could make out subtle disturbances in the frost patterns, footprint-shaped areas where the ice crystals melted and reformed. There were at least 3 sets of these invisible footprints, moving around the gravesite in careful coordination, each one corresponding to a cluster of flower movements. As I watched, one of the carnations, a particularly large white bloom, rose about 6 inches off the ground and rotated slowly before settling into its designated position. The movement was gentle, reverent, like someone handling a precious gift, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw the outline of hands cupping the flower, protecting it during its journey. By 5 a.m., the circle was complete. The invisible figures seemed to withdraw, and the temperature gradually returned to normal. The carnations settled into their final positions, arranged with the same mathematical precision I'd been observing for months. But as I prepared to leave, I noticed something new. Written in the frost around the flower circle, in delicate script that sparkled in the early morning light, were the words, "Para Elena, con amor eterno," for Elena, with eternal love. The next morning, I found Mrs. Valdez kneeling beside Roberto's grave, tears streaming down her face as she traced the flower circle with her finger. "He always did this," she said when she noticed me approaching. Whenever I brought flowers home, Roberto would arrange them in a circle on our kitchen table, said it meant our love had no beginning and no end. She looked up at me with eyes that held both sadness and wonder. I never told him I was bringing flowers here, but somehow, he knows. Somehow, he's still taking care of me. I chose not to mention the security footage or what I'd witnessed the night before. Some mysteries are meant to be experienced rather than explained, and some love stories continue long after death has separated the lovers. Mrs. Valdez still visits every Sunday, and Roberto still rearranges her flowers into perfect circles. I've stopped questioning the mechanism and started appreciating the message, that devotion can transcend physical death, that love finds ways to express itself, even when traditional communication becomes impossible. The flowers that remember teach us that the bonds we form in life don't simply end when breathing stops. They transform, adapt, and find new ways to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. And sometimes, if we're lucky enough to witness it, we get to see proof that love truly is eternal. There are passengers you deliver to their destination, and then there are passengers who were always meant to ride with you. I'm Angela Rodriguez, though everyone calls me Angie, and I've been a medical transport driver for Eternal Rest Services for 6 years. Most people don't think about what happens between the time someone dies and when their family sees them at the funeral home, but that's where I come in. I handle the respectful transfer of the deceased from hospitals, nursing homes, and private residences to funeral facilities throughout the Tri-County area. It's not glamorous work, but it's necessary, and I take pride in doing it right. Every person I transport was someone's mother, father, child, spouse. They deserve dignity in death, and that starts with how they're moved from one place to another. My van is always clean, temperature controlled, and equipped with proper restraints to ensure safe passage. I wear clean scrubs, keep detailed logs, and treat every pickup with the same respect I'd want shown to my own family. My shift typically starts at 6 a.m. with a review of the day's pickups and deliveries. The dispatch office provides me with a manifest that includes pickup locations, destination funeral homes, case numbers, and any special instructions from families or facilities. Most days I handle between 4 and 8 transports, driving routes that can cover over 200 miles through suburban and rural areas where funeral homes serve multiple communities. The work requires attention to detail and careful documentation. Every pickup gets logged with time, location, case details, and condition notes. Every delivery is confirmed with signatures from receiving funeral directors. At the end of each day, I reconcile my logs with dispatch records to ensure accuracy. In 6 years, I've never had a discrepancy until last month. It started when I was reviewing my monthly mileage report and noticed an inconsistency in my pickup count from Mercy General Hospital. My personal log showed 17 transports from Mercy during October, but when I cross-referenced with dispatch records, they only showed 16 authorized pickups. I assumed it was a clerical error. Maybe I'd miscounted or recorded a pickup twice. But when I examined my detailed daily logs, I found the 17th entry clearly documented. October 23rd, 11:37 a.m. pickup. Jane Doe, elderly female, approximate age 75. Peaceful expression, no visible trauma. The notes included details I always record. Wearing a simple gold wedding band, gray hair, neatly styled, small floral print dress. Someone had taken care with her appearance, suggesting she hadn't been unattended long before discovery. I called Mercy General's morgue to clarify the discrepancy. The attendant, Danny Morrison, has worked there for 12 years and keeps meticulous records. 16 releases in October, he confirmed. I've got all the paperwork right here. No Jane Does. Either very body was identified before release. That didn't make sense. I distinctly remembered the pickup, could visualize loading the gurney into my van, could recall the weight and balance as I secured the restraints. The woman had looked peaceful, like she'd simply fallen asleep. Her hands were folded across her chest in the traditional pose, and her wedding ring caught the fluorescent light as I adjusted the sheet covering her. I checked with the 3 funeral homes I delivered to that day. Riverside Memorial, Collins Family Funeral Service, and Peaceful Valley all confirmed receiving their scheduled pickups, but none had any record of an additional Jane Doe delivery. Their intake logs matched dispatch records, perfectly, no discrepancies, no unscheduled arrivals. The mystery deepened when I realized I couldn't remember where I delivered the Jane Doe. My other deliveries from that day were clear in my memory. Riverside at 1:15 p.m., Collins at 2:45 p.m., Peaceful Valley at 4:20 p.m. But there was a gap in my recollection, a missing piece that should have contained details about the 4th delivery. I started checking with other funeral homes in the area, expanding my search to facilities I'd never worked with before. None of them had received an unscheduled delivery on October 23rd. None had any record of a Jane Doe matching the description in my notes. It was as if the woman had simply vanished somewhere between pickup and delivery. Danny Morrison agreed to meet me at Mercy General to review their October records in detail. The morgue is in the basement, a sterile environment with stainless steel surfaces and the constant hum of refrigeration units. Danny pulled out a thick folder containing intake and release documentation for the entire month. "See, 16 releases?" he said, spreading the paperwork across his desk. "I remember every one of them. No Jane Does in October, and definitely no elderly woman matching your description." But as he spoke, I noticed something odd. The release forms were numbered sequentially, but there was a gap form. 17 was missing from the sequence. When I pointed this out, Danny frowned and rechecked the folder. "That's strange," he admitted. "The forms are pre-numbered. We should have 17. We searched his office thoroughly but couldn't locate the missing form. Danny checked the computer records. but they only showed 16 entries for October. Maybe it was a data entry error, he suggested, but his voice carried uncertainty. Danny wasn't the type to make mistakes with documentation. I decided to retrace my route from October 23rd, hoping something would trigger my memory about where I delivered the Jane Doe. I drove the same roads, stopped at the same facilities, tried to recreate the exact sequence of events, but the more I focused on remembering that fourth delivery, the more elusive it became. At the end of my route, I found myself parked outside Hillcrest Cemetery, about 15 miles from Mercy General. I didn't remember stopping there on October 23rd, but something about the place felt familiar. The cemetery was old, established in the 1930s, with weathered headstones and mature trees that created patches of deep shade even in daylight. As I sat in my van, watching late afternoon sunlight filter through the oak trees, I had a sudden, vivid memory, driving through the cemetery gates, following a narrow road that wound between sections of graves. I remembered stopping near a maintenance building, opening the back doors of my van, and helping an elderly man in work clothes transfer a gurney. But that couldn't be right. Cemetery workers don't receive direct deliveries from medical transport drivers. Bodies go to funeral homes first for preparation before burial. Yet the memory felt completely real the weight of the gurney, the careful navigation around headstones, the man's quiet thanks as he took responsibility for the Jane Doe. I drove through Hillcrest gates and followed the narrow road my memory suggested. Near the back of the cemetery, I found the maintenance building exactly as I'd remembered it. An elderly man was raking leaves nearby, and when he saw my van, he approached with a knowing smile. "You're the driver," he said simply. "Angela, right? You brought Mrs. Henderson home." I stared at him, my heart racing. Mrs. Henderson? Eleanor Henderson died at Mercy General on October 22nd. Family had prepaid for a direct burial, no service. She specifically requested to be brought straight here when her time came. Said she'd waited long enough to join her husband. He pointed to a fresh grave about 50 yards away, marked with a simple bronze plaque. Been waiting for someone to bring her home for 3 years. She's buried right next to Walter, just like she wanted. I followed his gesture and saw the grave marker, Eleanor Henderson, beloved wife, at peace with Walter. The date showed she died on October 22nd, the day before my mysterious pickup. "But I don't understand," I said. "How did you know to expect her? Who authorized the direct transport?" The old man smiled again, but there was something distant in his eyes. "Some folks make their own arrangements, Angela. Some folks just know when it's time to come home." As I drove away from Hillcrest Cemetery, I realized that Mrs. Henderson had been making her final journey on her own terms. Somehow, she'd arranged for pickup and delivery, without going through normal channels, without appearing in hospital records, without leaving a paper trail that anyone but me would remember. I still can't explain how she managed it, or why I was chosen to be her driver. But I've learned that death sometimes operates by rules we don't understand, and some passengers have destinations that exist outside our normal systems of documentation and control. My logs still show 17 pickups from Mercy General in October, and I've stopped trying to reconcile the discrepancy. Some journeys are meant to be taken quietly, without explanation or official record. Eleanor Henderson needed to get home to Walter, and somehow she found a way. I just hope that when my time comes, I'll have the same kind of determination to reach where I need to be. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but the dead don't always agree with our arrangements. I'm James Walsh, though most people call me Jim, and I've been a funeral director at Riverside Memorial Chapel for 23 years. In that time, I've conducted over 4,000 services, helped families through their darkest hours, and learned that death comes in many forms: peaceful, sudden, tragic, expected. But what happened during Thomas Brennan's service last week has shaken my understanding of what it means to be at rest. Riverside Memorial sits on a quiet street in the older part of town, a converted Victorian mansion that's been serving families since 1938. The building retains much of its original character: high ceilings, ornate woodwork, stained glass windows that cast colored light across the viewing rooms. We pride ourselves on providing dignified services that honor both the deceased and their loved ones, maintaining traditions that bring comfort during grief while adapting to modern needs and preferences. My typical day involves coordination with families, clergy, cemetery staff, and other service providers to ensure every detail is handled properly. I meet with grieving relatives to discuss their wishes, arrange flowers and music, oversee the preparation and presentation of the deceased, and guide families through the complex emotions that accompany loss. It's demanding work that requires equal parts professional competence and emotional sensitivity. Thomas Brennan was 78 when he passed from complications related to pancreatic cancer. He'd been under hospice care for 6 weeks, surrounded by family who'd had time to prepare for the inevitable. His daughter, Margaret, contacted us immediately after his death to arrange services according to his pre-planned specifications. Thomas had been very particular about his final arrangements: closed casket, no viewing, simple service with immediate burial. Margaret explained that her father had always been intensely private, uncomfortable with the idea of people looking at his body after death. "He made us promise years ago," she said. "Closed casket, locked tight, and no one opens it for any reason." He was adamant about that. The family had selected a substantial mahogany casket with a secure locking mechanism. Following Thomas's detailed instructions down to the type of interior fabric and the positioning of his hands, the preparation went smoothly. Thomas appeared peaceful, dressed in his favorite Navy suit with a small American flag pin on the lapel, recognition of his service in Vietnam. I positioned his hands in the traditional crossed arrangement, ensured his appearance was dignified, and sealed the casket according to family wishes. The locking mechanism engaged with a solid click that indicated proper security. The visitation was scheduled for Thursday evening, followed by a brief service Friday morning before burial at Oakwood Cemetery. About 40 people attended the Thursday viewing: family, friends, neighbors who'd known Thomas for decades. The atmosphere was appropriately somber but warm, with people sharing memories and offering comfort to Margaret and her siblings. It was during the quiet moments between conversations that I first heard the sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping: tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. So faint that I initially dismissed it as the building settling or perhaps someone's restless fingers drumming against a chair. But the sound seemed to originate from the front of the viewing room near the casket, and it had a deliberate quality that made me uncomfortable. I moved closer to investigate, positioning myself beside the casket while maintaining professional composure. The tapping continued, clearly audible. Now 3 measured taps, a pause, 3 more taps. The rhythm was too regular to be settling, too purposeful to be random noise, and it was definitely coming from inside the casket. My first thought was that we'd trapped air during sealing, creating some kind of pressure differential that was causing interior components to shift. Caskets are precision-built, but occasionally manufacturing defects or environmental factors can create unexpected sounds. I checked the locking mechanism still secure and examined the exterior for any signs of structural stress. Nothing appeared unusual. But the tapping persisted throughout the visitation, always in the same pattern, always during moments when conversation lulled and the room grew quiet. Several attendees noticed my frequent trips to the front of the room, and I deflected their questions with generic comments about temperature control and flower arrangements. I couldn't very well explain that I was hearing sounds from inside a locked casket. Margaret approached me near the end of the evening, concern evident on her face. "Is everything all right, Mr. Walsh? You seem troubled." I assured her that everything was fine, that I was simply ensuring all details were properly managed. But privately, I was deeply unsettled. In 23 years of conducting services, I'd never experienced anything like the deliberate tapping that seemed to be coming from inside Thomas Brennan's sealed casket. That night, I remained at the chapel after the family departed, ostensibly to prepare for the next day's service, but actually to investigate the mysterious sounds without observers. The building was dark except for security lighting, and the viewing room felt different without the warmth of living presence, colder, more hollow, filled with shadows that seemed to move independently. I positioned myself in the front row of chairs, directly facing the casket, and waited. For 20 minutes, silence. Then, precisely at 10:47 p.m., the tapping resumed. 3 deliberate strikes, pause, 3 more strikes. The sound was unmistakably fingernails against wood, coming from the interior of the casket. I approached the casket and placed my hand on the surface, feeling for vibrations that might explain the sound. Nothing. The mahogany was solid, room temperature, giving no indication of internal movement. But the tapping continued. Now seeming to respond to my presence, the rhythm quickened slightly, became more urgent, as if someone inside was trying to communicate. Against my better judgment, I spoke softly toward the casket. "Thomas, can you hear me?" The tapping stopped immediately. Complete silence for several seconds. Then a new pattern emerged. 5 rapid taps. Pause. 5 more rapid taps. Different from the previous rhythm, more insistent, almost frantic. I stepped back, my heart racing, trying to rationalize what I was experiencing, while simultaneously acknowledging that rational explanations were inadequate. Friday morning service proceeded without incident. The tapping had stopped completely, and I began to convince myself that I'd been hearing building noises or equipment settling. About 30 people attended the brief ceremony, after which we transported the casket to Oakwood Cemetery for burial. The graveside service was simple and dignified, exactly as Thomas had requested. But that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the scratching sounds and the way they'd seemed to respond to my voice. Against protocol and my own professional principles, I decided to open the casket and examine the interior. I told myself it was necessary to rule out mechanical issues that might affect future services, but honestly, I needed to know what had caused those deliberate, rhythmic sounds. Using the master key, I unlocked the casket in the privacy of our preparation room. The mechanism disengaged smoothly, and I lifted the upper half of the lid with careful reverence. Thomas appeared exactly as I'd left him, peaceful expression, hands folded, navy suit pristine. But something was different. His hands weren't positioned the way I'd arranged them. Instead of the traditional cross placement I'd carefully created, his right hand lay flat against his chest, while his left hand was positioned slightly lower, fingers extended as if reaching for something. The change was subtle but unmistakable. I'd positioned hundreds of deceased in their final arrangements, and I knew my own work. More disturbing were the scratches on the interior silk lining near his left hand. Fresh marks, clearly recent, as if fingernails had dragged across the fabric repeatedly. The scratches formed a pattern 3 parallel lines, repeated several times across the surface near where his hand now rested. The same grouping of 3 that had characterized the tapping I'd heard during the visitation. I examined Thomas's fingernails, expecting to find silk fibers or other evidence of the scratching. His nails were clean, neatly trimmed, showing no signs of having clawed at fabric. Yet the scratches were undeniably fresh, and they corresponded exactly to the rhythm I'd been hearing for 2 days. As I studied the evidence, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. Near Thomas's left hand, partially hidden by the silk lining, was a small folded piece of paper. I carefully extracted it and unfolded what appeared to be a handwritten note in Thomas's distinctive script. "Not ready yet. Tell Margaret the truth about Vietnam. She deserves to know." I stood in that preparation room for a long time, holding that note and trying to understand what Thomas Brennan had been trying to communicate from inside his sealed casket. The scratches, the tapping, the repositioned handsaw had been leading to this message, something he desperately needed his daughter to know. I resealed the casket without repositioning his hands, respecting what appeared to be his final choice about how he wanted to rest. But I kept the note, and 3 days later, I called Margaret to arrange a private meeting. I told her I'd found a letter her father had left in his suit pocket, something he'd wanted her to have after the service. When she read his words, Margaret began to cry, not from grief, but from relief. "I always wondered," she said, "about what happened over there, why he never talked about the war. This explains so much. The note contained details about Thomas's service, about friends he'd lost and choices he'd made, truths that helped his daughter understand the man he'd been. Thomas Brennan had used his final opportunity to reach across the boundary between life and death, ensuring that secrets he'd carried for 50 years wouldn't die with him. The tapping, the scratching, the movement inside his sealed casketol had been necessary to deliver a message that brought peace to both father and daughter. I've conducted dozens of services since then, but I listen more carefully now during the quiet moments. Sometimes the dead have unfinished business that requires more than burial to resolve, and sometimes our final arrangements need to accommodate communications we never expected to receive. There are visitors who come during visiting hours, and then there are visitors who come when the living world sleeps. I'm Robert Martinez, though everyone calls me Bobby, and I've been the night caretaker at Restwood Memorial Cemetery for 11 years. Most people think cemetery work is creepy, especially the overnight shift, but I find it peaceful. The dead don't demand anything from you except respect, and the quiet gives me time to think while I maintain the grounds that families depend on to honor their loved ones. Restwood spans 62 acres of gently rolling hills about 12 miles west of downtown. Established in 1949, when the city's older cemeteries reached capacity. We serve families from all walks of life, maintaining sections for different faiths and traditions while ensuring every grave receives the same careful attention. The grounds include a small chapel, administrative offices, maintenance facilities, and specialized areas like the children's section in the peaceful northeast corner. My shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Monday through Friday. The work involves security patrols, equipment checks, minor maintenance tasks, and ensuring the grounds remain undisturbed during the vulnerable night hours. I walk predetermined routes through different sections, checking for vandalism, fallen branches, damaged headstones, or any issues that need attention before families visit during the day. The night shift suits my temperament. I prefer solitude and find satisfaction in the methodical work of maintaining a place where people come to remember their loved ones. There's something honorable about being a guardian of memory, ensuring that final resting places remain dignified and peaceful. The deceased deserve our care, and their families deserve to find comfort when they visit. Most nights pass without incident. I might encounter a deer family grazing near the older sections, or find flowers that have been disturbed by wind. Occasionally, teens try to use the cemetery for parties or vandalism, but they're easily discouraged by a security presence. The work is routine, contemplative, allowing me to maintain the standards that grieving families rely on. About 3 months ago, I started noticing a visitor during my rounds. The first time, I was walking through Section C around 1:30 a.m. when I saw a figure moving between the headstones about 50 yards ahead. Male, average height, wearing what appeared to be a dark suit. Not unusual sometimes, people visit graves at odd hours when they need privacy for their grief. I maintained my distance to avoid intruding on what was clearly a personal moment. But as I continued my patrol, I noticed the man's destination seemed to be Section D, where we maintain graves for children and infants. He walked with purpose, taking a direct route through the older headstones toward the northeast corner. When I reached the same area 10 minutes later, he was gone. No car in the parking area, no sign of how he'd arrived or departed. Over the following weeks, I encountered the same visitor regularly, always between 1 and 3 a.m., always heading towards Section D, always disappearing by the time I completed my route through that area. He never acknowledged my presence, but he didn't seem to be hiding either, just focused on reaching his destination. The visitor appeared to be a young man, maybe mid-20s, wearing a navy blue suit that looked formal but not new. He walked with the measured pace of someone familiar with the cemetery layout, taking efficient paths between graves without needing to check section markers or reference maps. This wasn't someone wandering aimlessly. He knew exactly where he was going. After a month of these encounters, curiosity got the better of me. Instead of following my usual patrol route, I positioned myself near Section D and waited. At 2:07 a.m., I saw him approaching from the south, walking between headstones with that same purposeful stride. This time, I had a clear view of his face in the moonlight, young, clean-shaven, with an expression of quiet determination. When he reached the children's section, he stopped at a small grave marked with a simple granite stone. I was too far away to read the inscription, but I could see him kneel beside the headstone and remain there for several minutes. He appeared to be speaking, though I couldn't hear words from my position. After about 10 minutes, he stood, nodded once toward the grave, and walked toward a grove of oak trees at the section's edge. I followed, trying to maintain professional distance while satisfying my curiosity about this regular visitor. But when I reached the oak grove, he was gone. No sight of him continuing toward other sections, no sound of footsteps or vehicles. He'd simply vanished among the trees as if he'd never been there. The next night, I decided to approach him directly. When I saw him kneeling at the same small grave, I walked over slowly, making enough noise to announce my presence without startling him. As I got closer, I could see he was young, probably no more than 25, with dark hair and kind eyes. His navy suit was well tailored but showed signs of wear, as if it had been his best outfit for important occasions. "Good evening," I said softly. "I'm Bobby, the night caretaker. I've seen you visiting regularly." He looked up at me and smiled a genuinely warm expression that conveyed gratitude rather than surprise at being discovered. He nodded politely but didn't speak, then returned his attention to the grave. I could see the headstone now. Emma Rose Patterson, age 4, beloved daughter, dancing with the angels. "Family member?" I asked gently. He shook his head, still smiling that grateful smile, and pointed to himself, then to Emma's headstone. The gesture was clear he was here for her, watching over her, maintaining some kind of connection that didn't require words to understand. I left him alone that night, but the encounter stayed with me. The young man's presence felt protective rather than disturbing, like a guardian maintaining a vigil for a child who might otherwise rest alone. There was something peaceful about his dedication, something that reminded me why I chose this work in the first place. The following week, I started bringing 2 cups of coffee during my 2 a.m. rounds. When I encountered the visitor who I'd begun thinking of as Emma's guardian, I offered him one. He accepted it with that same grateful smile, holding the warm cup in both hands as if the gesture meant more than the coffee itself. We stood together in comfortable silence beside Emma's grave, 2 people sharing a moment of care for someone who couldn't thank us for the attention. This became our routine. Every night that he appeared, I'd bring coffee, and we'd stand together beside Emma Rose Patterson's grave. He never spoke, but his presence communicated volumes about dedication, love, and the responsibility that some people feel toward those who can no longer speak for themselves. Last Tuesday night, I decided to learn more about Emma and her family. The cemetery records showed she'd died in 2012 from complications related to leukemia. Her parents, David and Susan Patterson, had moved to Oregon 6 months after the funeral. The grave had no regular visitors listed in our maintenance logs, no family members, no friends who came to tend the site. But the records also showed something interesting. The original funeral had included a young pallbearer named Michael Cheno, relation to the family, but a volunteer from the children's hospital where Emma had received treatment. Michael had asked specifically to help carry her casket, saying he'd promised Emma he'd make sure she got home safely. That night, when the visitor appeared, I looked at him more carefully. The age was right, and there was something familiar about his gentle demeanor that matched what I'd expect from someone who worked with sick children. When he knelt beside Emma's grave, I could hear him speaking softly, not words, but what sounded like a lullaby, the kind of song that might comfort a frightened child. I realized then that Michael Chen had never stopped keeping his promise to Emma. Death hadn't released him from his commitment to ensure she felt safe and cared for. He continued his vigil, visiting her grave when the living world slept, maintaining a connection that transcended the boundaries between life and death. When I offered him coffee that night, I spoke Emma's name aloud. She's lucky to have someone who cares this much. He looked at me with those kind eyes and nodded, but for the first time, I could see sadness there, tooth weight of watching over someone who couldn't grow up, couldn't move on, couldn't experience the life she'd been denied. I understand now that some promises are too important to break, even when death tries to sever them. Michael's nightly visits aren't supernatural, they're simply the continuation of care that began in a hospital room and refuses to end at a gravesite. I still bring coffee for both of us during my 2 a.m. rounds, and Michael still accepts it with that grateful smile before disappearing among the oak trees. But I know now that he's not really disappearing, he's simply returning to wherever guardians go when their vigil is complete for the night. Emma Rose Patterson has been dead for 13 years, but she's never alone. Some people keep promises that death cannot break, and some children have protectors who refuse to let them face eternity without companionship. Some places hold more than just the living, and some comfort comes from sources we never expected to find. I'm Elena Kowalski, and I've been a mortuary assistant at Serenity Funeral Home for 7 years. Most people find my work unsettling, but I consider it a sacred trust helping families see their loved ones one last time with dignity and peace. The preparation process is both science and art, requiring technical skill and emotional sensitivity to ensure that death doesn't diminish the essential humanity of those we're privileged to serve. Serenity Funeral Home occupies a converted Victorian mansion on Elm Street, established in 1952 by the Hendricks family and maintained according to their original standards of excellence. The preparation rooms are in the basement, professionally equipped with modern ventilation, refrigeration, and climate control systems. We maintain 3 preparation tables, each designed for specific types of cases, with Table 3 reserved for our most challenging situations. My typical day involves coordinating with funeral directors, consulting with families about their wishes, and performing the detailed work that allows people to say goodbye to their loved ones with comfort and closure. Every case is different. Some require minimal intervention, others demand extensive restoration, but all deserve the same careful attention and respect for the person they were in life. The preparation process is methodical and precise. We begin with documentation, photographing the deceased and noting any special requests from families. Then comes washing, positioning, and the preservation techniques that allow time for viewing and services. Throughout the process, we maintain strict temperature control both for preservation purposes and out of respect for the dignity of those in our care. Table 3 has always been different from our other preparation surfaces. Located in the northeast corner of the room, beneath the building's original foundation stones, it's constructed from the same materials as tables 1 and 2, but consistently behaves in ways that defy logical explanation. The temperature around table 3 drops significantly whenever we use it, regardless of season or ambient conditions in the rest of the room. I first noticed the anomaly during my 2nd month at Serenity. I was preparing an elderly woman named Mrs. Catherine Walsh, adjusting the room temperature to our standard 72 degrees before beginning her care. Within minutes of positioning her on table 3, the digital thermometer showed 57 degrees in that immediate area, while the rest of the room maintained normal temperature. My initial assumption was a ventilation malfunction. The basement's HVAC system is complex, with multiple zones and specialized air handling for our unique requirements. I reported the issue to maintenance, expecting a quick repair, but after 3 visits from our service technician, no mechanical problems were identified. The cooling appeared to be isolated to the immediate area around table 3, with no discernible source. Over the following months, I documented the pattern carefully. Every time we used table 3, the temperature dropped between 12 and 18 degrees within the first 10 minutes. The cold wasn't uncomfortable, more like a gentle coolness that seemed to emanate from the table itself rather than from any external source. But it was consistent, measurable, and completely unexplained by our building systems. What made the situation truly puzzling was the reaction from families. Despite the temperature anomaly, or perhaps because of it, families consistently commented that their loved ones looked more peaceful when prepared on table 3. They used words like serene, comfortable, and at rest more frequently than with our other preparation areas. Several people mentioned that their family member looked happy, as if something pleasant had happened during the preparation process. I began paying closer attention to the faces of those prepared on table 3, and I noticed something remarkable. During the preparation process, many developed what I can only describe as a subtle smile-a-knot, the artificial expression we sometimes create for viewing, but a natural, peaceful expression that seemed to emerge spontaneously. It was particularly noticeable in cases where the person had died after suffering or had appeared troubled in their final moments. The smiles weren't something we created through positioning or technique. They appeared gradually during the preparation process, usually within the first hour of being positioned on table 3. The expression was gentle, genuine, as if the person had encountered something unexpectedly pleasant. It was beautiful to witness, but also deeply mysterious. I mentioned the phenomenon to Mr. Hendricks, Serenity's director, during one of our monthly staff meetings. He listened thoughtfully, then shared something I hadn't known about the building's history. Table 3 sits directly above the foundation of the original house, he said. Before we converted this space, it was the nursery where Mrs. Victoria Hendricks cared for children who'd lost their parents to influenza in 1918. According to family records, Victoria Hendricks had transformed the basement into a temporary nursery during the pandemic, caring for orphaned children until permanent arrangements could be made. She'd worked tirelessly, often sleeping in the same room to comfort frightened children who'd lost everything familiar in their young lives. Victoria herself had eventually succumbed to influenza, dying in that same basement room while caring for her charges. She was known for her gentle touch, Mr. Hendricks explained, could calm any crying child, make them smile even in the midst of grief. People said she had a gift for bringing peace to difficult situations. This information reframed my understanding of Table 3's mysterious properties. The cold wasn't mechanical, it was presence. Victoria Hendricks had never stopped caring for those who needed comfort, expanding her ministry from orphaned children to anyone who required peaceful transition from life to death. I began to observe the preparation process on Table 3 with new awareness. The temperature drop coincided with what appeared to be moments of interaction in visible hands, providing comfort, unseen presence offering reassurance. The smiles that developed weren't random. They were responses to care being given by someone who understood the importance of helping people transition with dignity. Last month, I was preparing a young father who died suddenly in a car accident, leaving behind 3 small children. His face had been marked by the trauma of sudden death, mouth set in a hard line, brow furrowed with what looked like worry. As I worked on Table 3, I felt the familiar temperature drop and watched as his expression gradually softened. Within an hour, he was smiling not broadly, but with the peaceful expression of someone who'd been reassured that his children would be cared for, that his sudden departure wouldn't leave them alone in the world. When his wife saw him during the viewing, she gasped and said, "He looks like he did when the kids were babies, like he's watching them sleep." I realize now that Victoria Hendricks continues her work in that basement room, providing the comfort and care that helps people transition peacefully from life to death. The cold spot around Table 3 isn't a malfunction, it's a blessing, a sign that someone who understood the importance of gentle care is still available to those who need it most. Families continue to comment on the peaceful appearance of their loved ones prepared on Table 3, and I've stopped trying to explain the temperature anomaly to maintenance staff. Some mysteries are meant to be experienced rather than solved, and some gifts are too precious to question. The preparation room's cold spot has taught me that care doesn't end with death, and that some people are so committed to helping others that they continue their work from beyond the grave. Victoria Hendricks spent her life bringing comfort to those who needed it most, and death hasn't changed her mission, it's simply expanded her capacity to serve. Every time I feel that gentle cold around Table 3, I know that the person I'm preparing isn't alone. They're being cared for by someone who understands the importance of transitioning peacefully, someone who ensures that death doesn't have to be faced without comfort and love. Some promises are too sacred to be broken by death, and some vigils continue long after the mourner joins the mourn. I'm David Wright, and I've been the director at Memorial Gardens Funeral Home for 35 years. In that time, I've conducted over 8,000 services, helped families through their darkest hours, and learned that grief takes forms we never expect. But what I discovered about the blue Cadillac that visits our parking lot every night has challenged everything I thought I understood about the boundary between dedication and obsession. Memorial Gardens sits on the corner of Maple and Oak Streets, a stately brick building constructed in 1967 when I was fresh out of mortuary school. The facility includes a main chapel that seats 200 smaller family rooms for intimate services, administrative offices, and preparation facilities that meet modern standards while maintaining the dignity that grieving families deserve. We also have a sizable parking lot with security lighting and camera coverage installed 5 years ago after some vandalism incidents. My work involves coordinating with families, clergy, cemetery staff, and other service providers to ensure every detail honors both the deceased and their loved ones. I've found that attention to small details, the arrangement of flowers, the temperature of viewing rooms, the timing of services can make enormous differences in how families experience their final goodbyes. Every service is unique, but all deserve the same careful attention and respect. The routine of funeral directing requires both professional competence and emotional sensitivity. Families come to us in crisis, seeking guidance through rituals they've never had to arrange before. My job is to translate their wishes into meaningful ceremonies that provide comfort and closure while respecting the memory of those who've died. It's demanding work, but deeply rewarding when done well. About 6 months ago, I started noticing unusual activity in our security footage. While reviewing recordings from the previous week, a routine task I perform every Monday morning, I observed a pattern that didn't match normal visitor behavior. Every night, at exactly 11:47 p.m., a blue car would enter our parking lot, park facing the chapel windows, and remain there for exactly 28 minutes before departing. The car appeared to be a late 70s Cadillac, well maintained despite its age, with chrome bumpers that reflected our security lighting. The driver never exited the vehicle, never approached the building, just sat facing our main chapel, as if observing something inside. At 12:15 a.m. precisely, the car would back out of the space and disappear down Oak Street. My initial assumption was that someone was using our parking lot for personal reasons, perhaps meeting someone, making phone calls, or simply finding a quiet place to think. Not unusual behavior, and not something that concerned me as long as the property wasn't being damaged. But the precision of the timing, the exact same arrival and departure schedule every single night, suggested something more deliberate than casual convenience. After 2 weeks of observing this pattern, I decided to investigate more thoroughly. I enhanced the security footage to get a better view of the license plate, hoping to identify the vehicle's owner. The plate was clearly visible. Michigan registration, the letters and numbers sharp enough to run through DMV records if necessary. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The car was registered to Mrs. Helen Morrison, who had died in 1982. I remembered her case clearly not because it was unusual, but because it was my first funeral as the newly appointed director at Memorial Gardens. Mrs. Morrison had been 63 when she passed from complications related to diabetes, leaving behind one daughter, Patricia, who was 38 at the time. Patricia Morrison had been devastated by her mother's death. They'd been exceptionally close, with Patricia serving as her mother's primary caregiver during the final years of illness. During our arrangements conference, Patricia had been very specific about certain details: her mother's favorite dress, particular flowers, music that held special meaning. But what I remembered most clearly was Patricia's promise at the graveside service. "I'll visit you every day, Mama," she'd said, tears streaming down her face as we lowered the casket. "Every single day until I can't anymore." And she had kept that promise. For over 20 years, Patricia Morrison visited her mother's grave daily, bringing fresh flowers, maintaining the headstone, spending hours talking to Helen about her life, her work, her hopes and fears. Other families noticed her dedication. Groundskeepers knew her schedule, and Patricia became something of a legend among regular cemetery visitors. But Patricia herself had died 15 years ago, in 2010, from the same complications that had claimed her mother. I'd conducted her funeral, a small service attended mainly by neighbors and a few distant relatives. She'd never married, had no children, and had spent most of her adult life caring first for her mother and then maintaining the connection after Helen's death. The realization that Helen Morrison's car was somehow still making nightly visits to our funeral home 30 years after her death and 15 years after Patricia's death left me deeply unsettled. I checked and rechecked the DMV records, confirmed the registration details, even called the department to verify that no clerical errors had occurred. The car definitely belonged to Helen Morrison, deceased since 1982. That evening, I decided to observe the mysterious visitor directly. I positioned myself in the funeral home at 11:30 p.m., with a clear view of the parking lot through our chapel windows. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the blue Cadillac entered the lot, moving slowly and carefully to a parking space that faced the building. Through the windshield, illuminated by our security lighting, I could see the silhouette of a woman in the driver's seat. She appeared elderly, with gray hair styled in a way that looked familiar, wearing what seemed to be a dark coat or jacket. She sat perfectly still, hands visible on the steering wheel, facing toward the chapel windows as if watching something inside. I studied her profile carefully, and recognition hit me like a physical blow. The woman in the car was Patricia Morrison. Not an elderly woman who resembled Patricia herself, exactly as she'd appeared during the last years of her life, when she'd visited the funeral home to discuss her own prearrangements. But Patricia had been dead for 15 years. As I watched, Patricia turned her head slightly, and for a moment, I could have sworn she was looking directly at me through the chapel windows. Her expression was peaceful, patient, as if she was waiting for something or someone. Then she returned her attention to whatever she was observing, maintaining her vigil with the same dedication she'd shown at her mother's grave. At 12:15 a.m. exactly, the Cadillac backed out of the parking space and drove away. I followed the car's progress as far as I could see down Oak Street, but it simply disappeared into the darkness, beyond our security lighting range. The next night, I positioned myself outside, standing near the front entrance where I could get a closer look at both the car and its occupant. Again, at 11:47 p.m., the blue Cadillac arrived and parked in the same space. This time, I could see Patricia more clearly. She was exactly as I remembered her, wearing the same style of clothing she'd favored in life, with the same careful posture and attentive expression. But as I moved closer to the car, I realized something that made my hands tremble. Patricia wasn't alone. In the passenger seat, barely visible in the dim lighting, sat another figure smaller, more frail, with the delicate features I remembered from Helen Morrison's funeral 30 years earlier. Mother and daughter were making their nightly visit together, maintaining a routine that had somehow transcended death. Patricia had kept her promise to visit every day, and now Helen was accompanying her daughter on these mysterious vigils, both of them watching over the funeral home where their final services had been conducted. I stood in that parking lot for the full 28 minutes, observing two women who should have been at rest but were instead continuing a ritual of love and dedication that death had been powerless to end. They never acknowledged my presence, never showed any awareness of being observed. They simply maintained their watch, as they had apparently been doing every night for years. When the car departed at 12:15 a.m., I felt a profound sense of loss mixed with wonder. Patricia Morrison had promised to visit her mother every day, and even death hadn't released her from that commitment. Helen Morrison had joined her daughter in this eternal vigil, ensuring that neither of them faced eternity alone. I still see them every night in our security footage, the blue Cadillac arriving precisely at 11:47 p.m., two silhouettes maintaining their patient watch through the chapel windows, departing exactly 28 minutes later. I've stopped trying to understand the mechanics of their visits and started appreciating the message that love creates obligations that transcend death. and that some promises are too sacred to be broken by the grave. Patricia Morrison taught me that dedication doesn't end with death, it simply finds new ways to express itself. Every night, she and her mother remind me that the bonds we form in life continue beyond the boundary of mortality, and that sometimes the most beautiful thing about death is discovering that love refuses to be buried. There are sounds that come from fire, and then there are sounds that come from what fire cannot touch. I'm Thomas Blackwood, though everyone calls me Tom, and I've been the head crematory operator at Eternal Rest Crematorium for 14 years. Most people don't think about what happens after a funeral service ends, but that's where my work begins. I handle the final transformation that returns the physical body to its basic elements, ensuring that families receive their loved ones' remains with the dignity and respect that death demands. Eternal Rest sits on 12 acres of wooded land about 15 miles outside the city, established in 2006 when local funeral homes needed additional crematory capacity. The facility includes 2 state-of-the-art cremation chambers, a viewing area where families can witness the beginning of the process if they choose, administrative offices, and a processing room where remains are prepared for return to families. The building is designed to be both functional and peaceful, respecting the sacred nature of the work performed there. My shift typically runs from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m., though emergency cases sometimes require evening or weekend work. The cremation process is carefully regulated, and documented. Each case requires specific paperwork, identification verification, and temperature monitoring throughout the cycle. A typical cremation takes between 2 and 4 hours, depending on the size of the deceased and other factors, followed by a cooling period before the remains can be safely processed. The work requires both technical skill and emotional sensitivity. Families trust us with their loved ones during the most vulnerable time in their lives, and that trust carries enormous responsibility. Every step of the process must be performed with precision and respect, from the initial preparation through the final return of cremated remains. It's solemn work, but deeply meaningful when done properly. The cremation chambers themselves are sophisticated pieces of equipment, capable of reaching temperatures up to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. They're heavily insulated, sealed systems designed to contain both heat and emissions while ensuring complete and respectful cremation. The chambers include monitoring systems that track temperature, pressure, and timing throughout each cycle, with safety features that prevent operation outside specified parameters. 3 months ago, during the cooling cycle following a routine cremation, I heard something that defied every principle of physics and engineering I understood about crematory equipment. It was a Tuesday morning, and I'd just completed a cremation for an elderly gentleman named Harold Peterson. The cycle had proceeded normally proper temperature curves, standard timing, no equipment anomalies. I was in the processing room, preparing paperwork for the next case, when I heard singing coming from Chamber 1. The voice was clear, melodic, unmistakably human. A woman's voice, older, with the practiced quality of someone who'd sung in church choirs for decades. She was singing Amazing Grace, specifically the verse about being lost and found, wretch and saved. The sound appeared to be coming from inside the sealed cremation chamber, which was impossible for multiple reasons. First, the chamber was sealed and had been throughout the cooling cycle. Second, the internal temperature was still over 600 degrees, far too hot for any living person to survive. Third, the chamber's design included sound-dampening materials that would make external noise virtually inaudible from inside, let alone the reverse. I checked the equipment immediately, looking for speaker systems, intercom malfunctions, or any other source for the singing. Nothing. The chamber monitoring systems showed normal readings, no anomalies in pressure or temperature. But the singing continued for approximately 4 minutes, ending just as the cooling cycle completed and the chamber was ready for opening. When I opened Chamber 1, I found exactly what I expected: cremated remains ready for processing. No evidence of anything unusual. But the memory of that clear, beautiful voice singing about grace and redemption stayed with me throughout the day. I convinced myself it had been an auditory hallucination, stress-related, or perhaps caused by equipment noise that my brain had interpreted as singing. Crematory work can be emotionally demanding, and 14 years of handling final remains takes a psychological toll that I might not have fully acknowledged. But the singing happened again the following week. This time, it was a man's voice deep, resonant, with the quality of someone who'd sung bass in gospel quartets. Same song, same verse, same apparent source from inside Chamber 2 during the cooling cycle. I was ready for it this time, moving quickly to the chamber controls to check every monitoring system. All readings normal, no external audio sources, no explanation for how a human voice could emanate from inside a sealed, superheated chamber. Over the following weeks, the singing became a regular occurrence. Not every cremation, but approximately once a week. Always during the cooling cycle. Always Amazing Grace. Always the same verse about being lost and found. The voices varied, sometimes women, sometimes men, occasionally what sounded like children's voices. Each voice was distinct, clearly different people, but all sang with the same peaceful quality. I began documenting the incidents carefully, noting the time, chamber, and characteristics of each voice. I also started staying closer to the chambers during cooling cycles, hoping to understand what was happening. The singing never lasted more than 5 minutes, always ended before the chambers were cool enough to open, and never occurred when other staff members were present. After a month of regular incidents, I contacted our equipment maintenance company to request a thorough inspection. The technician, Mike Rodriguez, had been servicing crematory equipment for 20 years and knew our chambers inside and out. He checked every component theating elements, ventilation systems, control panels, monitoring equipment. Everything's functioning perfectly, he reported. No malfunctions, no unusual wear, no issues that could cause audio phenomena. These chambers are sealed, system sound doesn't get in or out easily. I described what I'd been hearing, and Mike suggested we contact an acoustics engineer. Maybe there was some unusual resonance effect, some way that external sounds were being amplified or distorted by the chamber design. Dr. Sarah Chen from the university agreed to examine our facility and equipment. Dr. Chen spent 2 days testing our chambers with sophisticated audio equipment, measuring sound transmission, resonance frequencies, and acoustic properties. Her conclusion was definitive. There's no mechanism by which external sound could be transmitted from inside these chambers in the way you're describing. The chambers are too well insulated, and the internal temperatures would destroy any conventional sound sources. But she also said something that made my blood run cold. However, if sound is somehow being generated inside the chambers during operation, it would be acoustically impossible for it to reach you outside. What you're hearing shouldn't be possible. The next incident occurred while Dr. Chen was still conducting her tests. We were in the control room monitoring Chamber 1 during the cooling cycle following a cremation when the singing began. This time, it was a child's voice high, sweet, innocent singing about being lost and found with the pure trust that only children bring to hymns. Dr. Chen went pale as she heard it. Her equipment detected no sound sources, no audio transmission, no vibrations that could account for what we were both clearly hearing. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the space around us without appearing on any of her sensitive recording devices. "This is impossible," she whispered as the child's voice continued singing about Amazing Grace. "I'm hearing it, but nothing's registering on my equipment. It's like the sound exists only for human ears." That's when I understood what was really happening in our cremation chambers. The voices weren't mechanical malfunctions or acoustic anomalies. They were the voices of the people we'd cremated, singing their gratitude for the respectful transformation from physical existence to whatever comes next. The cremation process wasn't just reducing bodies to elements, it was completing a spiritual transition, and some souls felt compelled to acknowledge that completion with song. The verse they chose, "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see," perfectly captured the experience of moving from physical limitation to spiritual freedom. They were singing about being found, about seeing clearly for the first time, about the grace that carries souls through the transformation we call death. I realized that not everyone could hear the voices they seemed to manifest, only for those who approached the work with proper reverence and understanding. Dr. Jen heard them because she was genuinely trying to help solve the mystery. The maintenance staff, who viewed the chambers purely as mechanical equipment, never experienced the singing. The voices continued to appear during cooling cycles, usually once or twice a week. I've learned to listen for them, to appreciate them as confirmation that our work is being conducted with the respect and dignity that spiritual transformation requires. Each voice is different, reflecting the unique personality of the person making their final earthly communication, but all express the same message of gratitude and peace. Last week, I heard a voice I recognized, Harold Peterson, the elderly gentleman whose cremation had been followed by the first singing incident 3 months ago. His voice was exactly as I remembered it from the few conversations we'd had when his family made arrangements. He sang the same verse, but this time I understood that he was thanking me personally for handling his transformation with care and respect. I've stopped trying to explain the voices to equipment manufacturers or acoustics experts. Some phenomena exist beyond the reach of scientific measurement. Some communications transcend the boundaries of physical possibility. The singing reminds me that cremation isn't just a technical process, it's a sacred ritual that helps souls complete their journey from one existence to another. Every time I hear those voices singing Amazing Grace, I'm reminded that the work we do here touches something far deeper than chemistry and physics. We're not just operators of high-temperature equipment. We're facilitators of spiritual transformation, guardians of the sacred passage that carries souls beyond the reach of earthly limitation. The voice in the crematorium teaches me that some songs are sung not by vocal cords and lungs, but by spirits expressing gratitude for respectful treatment during their final earthly transition. And sometimes, if we listen with the right kind of attention, we can hear the music that death cannot silence.